Have you ever wondered what makes an Illenium song sound like an Illenium song? Most melodic bass producers have the same goal. They want their stuff to sound like the pros. So they watch YouTube tutorials, buy preset packs, buy sample packs, and somehow they still end up with a song that sounds novice. It just doesn't sound like their reference in their playlist. Hey, I'm Kevin. I've been producing music under the name AWAKEND for over a decade, and in that time, I've released 2 official remixes for Illenium, remixes for Seven Lions, Jason Ross, AU5, and more. I've released on labels like Ophelia, Heaven Sent, Enhanced, Proximity, and I've also mentored multiple producers who have gone from never releasing a song to putting out official remixes for Illenium themselves. So, in the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through what it actually takes to get a song sounding like Illenium. The specific elements, the way they sit together, and the small decisions inside of Ableton that take a song from almost there to actually sounding just like the real thing. So, before we begin, let me show you guys what I made and how it sounds. So, as you guys can see, I have the original source audio here to provide a sort of build-up, and then everything to the right of that is my drop and the layers that I made. So, we're going to start with the saws. If you've ever tried to make music that sounds like Illenium, this is probably the first sound you were chasing. This is the single most important element in this drop. It's what gives it the power, the emotion. It's what makes an Illenium drop sound like an Illenium drop. So here's the first thing that most producers get wrong. They assume the way that you get that big Illenium sound is by adding tons of voices to your chords, by detuning as hard as possible, by having a ton of instances of Serum. And honestly, the result most often is just a generic super saw soup. What I'm actually doing here is very different. The saws are detuned, but only a little bit, just enough to give them a big stereo width. But the key is they're not detuned so much that they lose tonality and just turn into noise. They maintain that presence, that warmth, that sort of grit that you can only get from slightly detuned super saws. So as you can see here, this is the main super saw layer. There's not much going on, right? Simple saw layers, a little bit of low cutting, high passing, detuning, not super high, right? 0.07, 0.04. And the effects, a little bit of distortion, multiband compressor, a little bit of EQ to take off some of the highs. Nothing super crazy. So one of the other important things about the saws, they're very warm. If you look at this EQ, they have a bunch of that low frequency in the 100 to 400 hertz range, right? So that's what keeps it warm, gives it that presence, gives it that tonality. Then the other thing is the texture of the saws themselves, right? They sound kind of gritty, warm. They have a bit of high end, but they're not super bright. If you listen to the original. And the way that you achieve that grit is by having some distortion like I showed you guys earlier, but then also some OTT applied to the saw layer. And this is how my OTT currently looks. Something else you'll notice is that I've boosted the stereo width using a utility so that the saws become really wide. They feel really big. It's a really easy cheat code to make something sound much wider. And I use this all the time in my own music. I used this on both the Illenium remixes that I released. So I'm going to show you guys again the saws by themselves and then mixed into the whole drop. So the next super important factor that makes an Illenium song sound like an Illenium song is the chords that he's using. On screen here, you guys can see this is the chord progression that he used in Fractures. I basically just remade it from scratch. So what's happening here, this is in the key of E major, as you can see up here. This is a 6-4-1-5 chord progression. It's a very standard chord progression. It's used in thousands of pop songs that you've heard, thousands of EDM songs that you've heard. So there's nothing particularly special about it. But the thing is, if you want to get that Illenium style super saw sound, one of the hallmarks is that you're going to be using fewer voices than you might think. If you look at the voicing here, I'm really only using maybe 4 or 5 voices per chord. Every note is very intentional. I keep the root note of the chord on the bottom. These are the same notes that my bass is playing. And you'll also notice that I found a common note between most of the chords. So I have this E playing on the first 3 chords. which then shifts down to a D sharp for this B chord. One of the other things that gives these chords some flavor is harmonies. So for example, there's an F sharp on this third chord, the E chord, which is basically the second. So if we took that F sharp away, versus with it, it gives it that sort of bright, sort of hopeful feeling. So that's always the thing with Illenium chords, right? It's a major scale, but it's sort of a minor feeling. So it's kind of this like hopeful but sad sort of feeling. And that's part of how he achieves it. So one of the main points I want to reiterate here is that you don't need 10 notes per chord to make it sound big. In fact, if you have too many notes on any given chord, it's going to end up sounding messy, complicated, kind of noisy. You can lose the emotion or lose the story that the chords are trying to tell. So in general, keep your chord voicings simple. 3 to 5 notes is plenty. So next up, we have the vocal chop. This is by far and away one of the most signature, one of the most recognizable things that Illenium does in many, many of his drops, almost all of them probably. The thing that I've always personally admired about the way that Illenium does this is that these vocal chops don't get out of control. He just basically takes really well thought out pieces of vocal, cuts it into pieces, and then has the main hook kind of playing intermittently between those. And on the surface, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, yeah, duh, that's how vocal chops work. But a lot of other producers, when they do vocal chops, they make them super pitch bendy, they make them super high pitch or really low pitch, they do a ton of processing to them. But in this case, Illenium just basically takes the vocal and just chops it up and just puts it on the drop. It doesn't sound like it's been heavily processed or anything super crazy has been done to it in this specific case. So let me show you guys what he did to make this vocal chop. Yeah, so let me just show you guys what I actually did to recreate the vocal chop he's using. So the main chop that goes da, da, da is just a piece of the vocal that comes from here. What comes after? So that part repeats. Right, and then we go back to that part of the vocal. And these two pieces of the vocal are actually right next to each other, usually. Right, so it's what comes after, tiny fractures, but he's actually splitting these up by a bar. And then one more time. So that's basically all it is. And as you can see, there's really nothing happening here crazy, right? It's just an OTT, kind of squashing them, making it a little bit brighter, taking out some harshness up top here in the mid-highs, shaving off the high end, and then it's just sidechained to the kick and the snare. That's it. So in order to get that signature Illenium sort of vocal chop, you don't need crazy processing. This isn't a super complicated process. What he does extremely well here is he chooses these sounds specifically for the melody and the emotion that they tell on the drop. So if you listen to the drop with and without this, right? Feels a lot more generic without it. And so in this case, that vocal chop is really the main driver of melody in the drop. There's no real strong lead melody outside of that vocal. And because it's such a good vocal, Illenium lets that just drive the entire drop. We're already used to hearing that melody, but he presents it in a slightly different way. So even though it's the same thing we've already heard, it's chopped up in a new way so it feels fresh. Okay, so next up, we're on to the drums. Now, there's a couple of really key things that make Illenium drums sound like Illenium drums. First, we'll start with the kick. And so typically, a melodic dubstep or a melodic bass kick is going to sound a lot more like this. Short and punchy, right? However, with the Illenium kicks, they sound huge, right? They're thumpy, they have that chest rattling low end. So the way that Illenium makes these kick drums, he takes a taiko drum and then layers it with your typical sort of melodic bass or melodic dubstep type of kick. So this is what these sound like together. I'm going to adjust these envelopes a little bit. Right, so this isn't the exact right perfect sample to use as the example of how it sounds compared to the actual kick I'm using, but this is here to illustrate the point that you're basically taking this big, long, thumpy, almost like tom drum that somebody might hit with a big drumstick, and then you're layering that with something punchier like a normal kick drum, and so the end result is something like this. And for most of us, this is the first time we had ever heard a kick drum like this. And so that's part of what gave Illenium his signature sound. So if you want to make something sounding more unique like Illenium, figure out a way to layer some other drums with a normal kick drum, something that's unique, something that no one's done before. So next up is the Illenium snare. Now, the style of snare he uses has changed over the years, same with his kick drum, but in this song and many of his songs, some of the common themes that I've noticed with his snares, they're very bright, they're very punchy, and they have a bit of space. So when I say bright, I mean it has a nice amount of frequencies in the high frequency range, so above like 8 kilohertz. When I say punchy, I mean that it has a very strong transient. And when you zoom in on this snare, you can kind of see how intense the front end of this snare is, right? That's basically the transient there. You have this front end transient right here, right? So if you take the transient off, right? So it's that first little chunk of sound. That's what makes the snare really cut through the mix. It's very sharp. And then the other thing is that he's got a bit of reverb on his snare, it sounds like. Right, so if I turn this off, now it's very important the amount of reverb we're using here. It's a very short reverb, 1.2 seconds, right? So it's almost like a short room reverb. So this is just enough reverb to make the snare feel like it's sort of back in the mix. It's not directly in front of you like a typical dubstep snare would be. And it makes it feel huge, right? It makes it feel much bigger in the mix. Something else I see Illenium doing a lot that I can kind of hear in most of his songs is that he also typically layers his snares. So a couple of key points to make here if you want to layer a snare. Ideally, you want it to be the same tone and the same pitch. So this snare is B, right? It's a B note. This snare is an A note, which means that I need to bring it up 2 semitones. So I've warped it, put it on complex, and then I brought it up 2 semitones. So it's the same pitch. It has a B note as the fundamental kind of lowest frequency. This one here. Then the other thing is, when you layer a snare, you want to fade that transient in a little bit. You don't want these to overlap, right? So I've faded that transient in so that when they layer on top of each other, they don't fight for space in the mix. And the other thing I'm doing here, I'm taking off all the low end. Because otherwise it's going to compete with the main snare. And then both of these together. So next up is the mid bass. Most producers put too much emphasis on the saws and not enough emphasis on the mid bass. This is what makes up that really critical frequency range from about 70 to 120 hertz, or about 70 to 150 hertz. Without it, the drop is going to sound really hollow, it's going to be lacking in power, and it's just not going to have that warmth that you need to have a big Illenium style drop. So on its own, this is what this mid bass sounds like. And then in the mix, so you can see how big of a difference that makes, right? Without the mid bass, the drop just kind of falls apart. It just loses all of its power and all of its warmth and depth. Now, here's the critical thing that most producers get wrong. When it comes to mid basses, producers either have their mid basses too high of an octave, or they low cut their mid bass, so they remove the low frequencies that this mid bass needs in order to feel powerful. So let me show you what I mean. So the first big frequency spike here from these mid basses is right around 65, 70 hertz, right? And that's going to change depending on the note that's playing. Now, that's a critical frequency space for these basses to sit inside of. If you don't have anything in the 70 to 120 hertz range, your mid basses are going to completely lack power. So what I've noticed with people like Illenium, and what I've also been incorporating into my own music, you want these mid basses to be playing the lowest possible octave. And then ideally, you want them to be sitting between that 70 and 120 hertz range on the low end. So as an example, if I brought up this first mid bass by an octave, right, it's sitting at the very top right here at like 120. That's way too high, right? If we go too low, it just loses its tonality, right? It just sounds like it's grinding. So you want to find that sweet spot. The lowest octave you can have it without going too low or too high, and you want it to be sitting in that 70 to 120 hertz range. So now let me play the drop again, And if I had my mid basses at an octave too high, or if I, let's just say, low cut this up to 150, let's play the drop again with that. Right, so it's almost like if I low cut my mid basses to 170, it's almost like they're not even there. It almost sounds the same as it does without even having mid basses. So mid basses play a very important role in the lower frequencies, the lower mid frequencies, and the mid range frequencies. But the most important range for those mid basses is that 70 to 120 hertz range. That's where you get that power and that warmth from. All right, so let's look at these mid basses with a little bit more detail and kind of see what's going on. It's actually super simple. So this first layer is just basically a preset that I caught from an Illenium pack that I tweaked a little bit. The main thing to keep in mind here, the biggest takeaway, is that it's basically a single voice right in the center of the mix. It's a triangle wave. And then I have a slightly detuned second layer, which has the blend and the detune turned way down. So it also, again, kind of sits in the center, right? It's not super wide. After that, I just have some EQing. Without that, here's how it sounds. So basically, we're taking off the sub bass, again, cutting around 80, not too low, not too high, taking out some of the muddy low mids, and then just taking off all the high end. I'm also using a mid-side EQ. I'm taking off all the low end from the sides of the mix here, because my second bass, which is another one that I made, has a lot of width to it. It's got a lot of stereo width. So this is a mid bass that I made to sound like Last Heroes. Again, super simple, right? Detuned saw wave. There is a bit of hyperdimension, detuning it. There's a little bit of chorus. There's a little bit of distortion and EQ. So without that stuff, here's how it sounds. And then the other thing to pay attention to here is I've turned up the stereo width to 160%, so it becomes really wide. I took off all of the low end and the high end in the mono, because again, this is my wide bass. I don't need it to be mono. I already have that layer. And then again, using the side EQ of the mid side EQ, I just took out some of the lower mid frequencies because these get kind of muddy, 250, 600. And then I did a high cut to remove all the high end. And that's the mid basses. So next up in our line of elements is the sub bass. Now, this is another spot where I see a lot of producers get it wrong. They overthink it. They use crazy processing and all sorts of fancy tools and plugins. In reality, the sub that I use, the sub that the vast majority of massive producers that I know of use, is super simple. So all this is, it's just a sine wave inside of Serum. I've drawn in some custom harmonics. Let me just show you what that does. If you see these harmonics here, right? So you have the sub, the lowest frequency. Then you have these harmonics coming down. So that's what these are. Without it, it's just a single sine wave, right? So we draw in a little bit of this, draw in a little bit of that. And now this is the other key. I put a saturator on it. If you're using decent headphones or studio speakers, you should have noticed a big difference there, right? It got a lot louder and it got a lot more present when I turned that saturator on, in part because it did turn up the volume, but also in part because it added these harmonics. So I see producers doing this sort of thing all the time. They just high cut it right here. Or it's just a sine wave. Or again, it's some crazy preset with way too much going on. The reality is, if you want a clean, powerful sub that really rattles your chest on a big sound system with a subwoofer, keep it simple. And then let me show you guys the drop without the sub. Again, this will be subtle if you're not listening on decent headphones or studio speakers or something like that. But a big part of the reason why we want some harmonics on our sub is because it makes the sub translate and become more audible on smaller sound systems. Now, there's one more element before I want to circle back and talk again about the Super Saw stack, and that is the supporting percussion. So let me play you guys the whole drum loop that I've made here. So without the supporting percussion, this would still groove, but it would really be lacking, right? So if I turn off the supporting percussion and just play the kick and snare, you notice how much less interesting that is, right? You don't really groove. It doesn't really give you that sort of head nod feeling. And so a couple of things are happening here. For one, there's an offbeat snare that plays every third or fourth kick. Next, we have a shaker loop. This was originally 82, or rather 172 beats per minute. I warped it, repitched it, which preserves the transients, and then we end up with this, which in context now sounds like this. And finally, we have a ride and hat loop. Again, this is 130 BPM, so I stretched it, warped it, and it had a snare built into it. So I faded that snare away, and then I took away the low end using an EQ. So that's what this sounds like. And then again, all together. And let's play the whole drop, but without that stuff. So the movement of the drop really comes alive with those layers. Without those sounds, the drop is just a lot more lifeless. It doesn't really make you kind of dance and want to like head nod and kind of groove along, right? All right, guys, quick pause before I move on to the final point. So as you can see, I've built out this entire Ableton project file that we've been walking through. It has every layer labeled, the saws, bass, kick, etc., just all of it. So if you want to download that Ableton project file and study how an actual Illenium quality song is made and put together layer by layer, there's a link in the description below. Go ahead and go download it. It's totally free. So this is the final and most important point of this whole video. If you only take away one thing from this entire tutorial, I want it to be this. Earlier, I was talking about the saws, right? I was describing how they're warm, gritty, minimally detuned, and the thing is, I lied to you guys. The reality of this drop is that there's actually only one single saw layer in this entire drop. Over my years of mentoring producers, what I've seen is most people think that they need like 4 or 5 super saw layers to get that big, thick sound. The reality is sometimes you only need one really perfectly tuned, gritty saw layer, and it's going to make your drop sound massive, even bigger than it would if you had 5 or 6 saw layers. So as you can see, these are just empty tracks, right? There's nothing here. So there actually is a choir layer in here. It's very subtle. I'm not sure you necessarily need it, but it does give the saws a little more of that organic feeling. And then again, the main saw. So the entire sound, right? That classic Illenium stack. In a lot of cases, you can literally make that with one single Serum. The reason that I can get away with just having one single saw layer like this is because it has just the right exact amount of detuning, EQing, OTT, distortion, everything is dialed in perfectly. So if you just grab some random Illenium preset, it's never going to sound this good. One of the keys here is that I am doing some EQing, right? So I'm low cutting this at about 110 Hertz. I'm removing a little bit of this lower mid frequency range at 350. And then I'm taking away some of this harshness in these mid highs, right? This 2.97 kilohertz, 5.74 kilohertz. I'm also high cutting it at 8.9 kilohertz. This layer is very bright without this EQ. Kind of piercing, in fact, right? And so that's where this white noise comes in. I have a separate white noise layer. And this allows me to independently control that white noise and turn it up or down according to how much of it I want in my drop. So that's the big takeaway. Most producers spend years thinking the reason their drop doesn't sound full or powerful is because they need more layers, more sounds, more layers, more sounds. The reality is, what you really need to do is spend more time tweaking and diving into every single individual sound. In this drop, every sound has a very specific purpose. Each layer has been meticulously dialed in, and without any one of them, the drop sort of falls apart. If you want a bigger picture on how I think about melodic bass overall, not just specifically the Illenium sound, but melodic bass and melodic dubstep as a whole, click the video that popped up at the end of this one. It's 8 years worth of advice condensed down into a very short video. I think it's going to change how you approach every song and every layer from now on. I'll see you guys over there.